All right, next I want to talk about the economic geography. And in the 1900s, a lot of people called that the American century. That's when the United States became an economic powerhouse and a leader of the world, both economically and in influence. And there is also an idea of this as in the 2000s being the Asian century, that there's a rebalance happening where Asia is becoming likewise a big powerhouse like the United States had been traditionally. And there's good reasons for that. Big population, large workforce, long history of being an economic powers. Before the Industrial Revolution, China was the wealthiest part of the world. And in recent times, it's really catching up quickly in terms of economic growth. It's like the Industrial Revolution, but just super fast has happened in East Asia. So it has large economies. The three largest economies in the world are China, the United States, and Japan. So in East Asia, we have two of the three largest economies. And in some way, China and US are pretty close to each other in terms of their, depending on how you measure it, the size of their economies. But there's still a lot of poverty as well, especially in the rural areas. So it's not always evenly, the growth isn't always even. A lot of it has been concentrated in some of the kind of high growth areas of China. And where there's a lot of money, there's a lot of money that's being developed because of all the industry in China, but there's a bigger gap growing between the rich and the poor, especially in the poor rural areas. And that gap helps to kind of draw in people into the urban areas. But well, if we want to look at the growth of the economies in East Asia, we have to start with Japan, because Japan was a fairly industrialized country prior to World War II. I mean, it was big enough that it challenged, we fought them. The United States and Japan were locked in in war during World War II, but the U.S. won. But after the war, the U.S. tried to make it an ally because in the Cold War, helped them like with Western Europe, rebuild some of their economy, but their economy really took off like a rocket. It's called the Japanese miracle. And Japan really came right back as an economic superpower after World War II. So by the 1960s, Japan had was making a lot of products, television, cars. If the way we think about, if you think about today about all of the computer products and phones and things that are made in China, Japan used to be that. It used to be that people said the same thing about Japan that they say about China now. And it still continues, but in Japan, it's a little different because it's like higher end products, like automobiles, scientific equipment. They are a major producer of these types of goods. Say leader, not leaser. Okay, so one, you have Japan. After Japan, you had four other economies that really kind of really rocketed in the into the, from the 60s to the 90s after Japan really took off. You had four that kind of came after it called the Asian Tigers. These are strong, industrialized, export-oriented economies like Japan was. So this does not include Japan. Japan was earlier. There are four. There's South Korea, there's Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. We'll cover Singapore more later because it's a little bit outside of the realm. It's in the Southeast Asian realm. And around Singapore, you have what are called new Asian tigers, but we'll talk more about those in the next chapter. So you have Japan 1, 2, you have the tigers, right? Now, at this time, China was lagging behind because it was still under all, it was still mostly a communist economic system. However, just off the coast here, you had Taiwan and Hong Kong. Their economies really taking off. So the way China's economy developed initially was through special economic zones. China, seeing the growth of these Asian tigers, started to set up special zones where there was different government regulations to encourage foreign investment. The two big ones, and I'll use these as an example, is this Pudong one, and this is centered around Shanghai. And we have a Chinese area called Shenzhen, which kind of surrounds Hong Kong. And these are now kind of the two, first Hong Kong, then Shanghai became two big economic powerhouses of the Chinese economy. Let's take a closer look at Shenzhen. So this is called the Guangdong province of China. You have Hong Kong here. So it's like this island, it's a little bit of a separation here. And Hong Kong wasn't controlled by China, it was controlled by the British into the 1990s and became an economic powerhouse in this region. And over time, this influenced China, this kind of drew investment from China into the Shenzhen region, which is now, I mean, Shenzhen is like the size of New York City, and that happened within like a decade. This is a rapidly growing part of China. This is where a lot of the high tech, this is like a super high, this is like their big tech hub right here near Hong Kong. And a lot of that came because of working through Hong Kong initially. And so that's what kind of spurred the growth of the Shenzhen region. So this whole area, this is that Pearl River estuary that includes Shenzhen and Hong Kong. It's the most productive economy of its size anywhere in the world. This is a super high manufacturing, just a lot of money. About half of Chinese exports come from this kind of region of Shenzhen, Hong Kong. And by the way, just a side note, like I mentioned, the Shenzhen is considered the fastest growing city in human history, that this is really happening at a fast pace. So just to recap, we have Japan initially, World War II to the 1960s. After Japan, we have the Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. And Hong Kong and Taiwan become conduits for trade with China. So because Taiwan and Hong Kong are their close proximity, they start to kind of tap into the Chinese market. Eventually, the Chinese kind of take on, kind of catch on to this, and they become like a tiger, but because they're so big, they really surpass the other economies and have really grown to be this one of the biggest, one or two biggest economy in the world because of these special economic zones and their connections through these Asian tigers, particularly Taiwan and Hong Kong. And part of the change with that economic growth is high rural to urban migration. The need for workers in all these factories have made it so that Chinese is now mostly urban. It used to be rural, like in India. So this is in the, like early 1900s. Not that many people in cities, mostly in the country, but as we get into the 2000s, that flipped, where we have more people in the cities, fewer people in the countryside. The United States has about 50 urban areas, like city areas, big city areas that are over 1 million people. And in China, you have over 170. So just massive amount of these urban areas spread throughout the country. They do have some regulation of who can move to the cities. They have what's called the Hoku system. It determines, you have to have permission to move to the cities, but like with migrant workers in the US, you have a huge floating population that either legally or illegally floats in and takes up jobs that need to be filled. So these are major cities. You can see them concentrated here in the east. A whole lot of urbanization occurring in China, especially along the coastal areas, but also in the interior as well. This is the Shenzhen, Hong Kong area. And this is showing the GDP, like the economic growth by province. And you can see, especially in the east here, that the huge growth in Guangdong here which is down here near Hong Kong. and this area near Shanghai as well. It's kind of 3D. It's kind of some height to it, but these are the two big economic zones of China.